Hello. I've been thinking about for a couple years changing up the video style. I've been struggling with what that would be. I still don't know. But um but I think you know, I've been thinking about, daily videos. So I wanted to make one today. So according to the clock, I slipped into tomorrow. So whatever. Um Now, it's not a cross section of my life like what I'm thinking about. What I spent most time thinking about today was that, I was doing some pro bono work for a not profit around here, around these parts. And I'm not going to talk about that. I'm talking about just sort of what's going on in the philosophical compartment. And not even a cross section of that really, but just basically what I thought I'd talk about was the fact that most people feel like failures. I think it's most people. And I think the reason that it's possible for most people to feel that way is just, the human imagination is epic, and it's not so much that people have a too high of a standard, they have too much of a fantasy standard, right? It's good to have high standards, but when your standard goes into fantasy, well, the problems with the standard, right? So, for example, I'll tell you what I mean. When I was in my later teens, maybe mid-teens, you know, I had seen some Playboys. We didn't have the internet back then. Porn was rare, difficult to get, and those were some beautiful women in there. I also had a hippie dad, so we went to these nude beaches and the river and stuff, and mostly it's just old people and hippies of various sorts, but sometimes, there's some pretty hippies come along. And I noticed, let's just say that I noticed that um, there's a beautiful woman and she disrobes. That's what a beautiful woman looks like, disrobed. And it didn't look like a Playboy model. And I realized, well, posing for a shot and getting airbrushed made the Playboy model, a fantasy thing. It's kind of like I saw the couple commenters, few commenters now actually, right in a row. So maybe it was the same person even in different videos, but with an MRA attitude with, it's like all women should be like anime girls. It's like, well, anime girls are a fantasy. Maybe they are great, but the real thing's always better than the fantasy. If you find you've gone into the unreal part of Fantasyland, because you can fantasize and imagine real things or things that could potentially be real. You know what I'm saying? You could have a realistic imagination. But a real thing is always beats a fantasy thing, and I realize, well, geez, I want to be attracted to real women, not fantasy women. And it's much true with people's uh, sense of failure. That they're comparing to, well, I'm talking about them comparing to their own fantasies, but most people are stuck comparing themselves to their parents' fantasies, even, one step even removed. And, don't get me wrong, I don't want to insult anybody. I'm not saying you're not a failure. I'm just saying that I notice a lot of people that consider themselves failures, they've noticed that their life could be better. The realistic part of their imagination is confirm that, and I would confirm could be better. But it's not as bad as they say, right? And it's kind of this thing with violence and civil war. People that are willing to see violence and civil war is kind of, generally speaking, it's going to be because well, I saw some comments of guys going, I'm 40, I want to have a civil war before I get too old. And, they want to prove themselves. And they want they want to structure their lives basically is the real goal. And the fact is that their life would be way worse if a civil war did break out, if it was just violence all over, which is probably not likely to happen. I've been realizing as I think about it. So trying to not be as worried about that because, of course, that's been the thing that really concerned me about Trump is civil unrest. So when something like Charlottesville happens, I'm like, oh, it's happening. And I realize, okay, well, it's not happening yet. But their lives are way better than they think. Their standard is not a historical standard, it's this fantasy standard. And so, really most people like in America's their lives are better than they think. Now, when your life is really bad, it's true that probably humans tend to think it's better than it is. And so a lot of humans and normies, as they might call them these days, think that their life is better than it really is. And that's an issue. I would say it's a problem. But in the context of this, we're really talking about, well, what's your real situation? It's not ideal. There's realistic comparisons, realistic imaginations. They can be used for a realistic comparison to say, hey, it ought to be better. We should fight for social justice, meaning justice for everybody. And, that's an important thing to pursue, to idealize, to try to realize. But our lives are pretty much not as bad as they seem. I mean, we might be a failure in our parents' eyes. That's a funny one though, actually, for me. I mean, I tried to I idolized my dad in a way where I tried to mimic the persona he was projecting, only to find out later that he was just projecting it. Um, but that was all subconscious. I never had a conscious idea that I gave a shit what my parents or anybody else's judgments of me were. I mean, one of my things where I think maybe I'm schizophrenic, but I managed it or something, or it's mild, is I remember when I was around 8 or 9 that there were voices in my head talking to me, kind of criticizing, or not criticizing so much as chit-chatting and saying, things that if it was real people would be kind of embarrassing to have a group of people sitting. And I thought, is that really true? Could there be these spirits here? And it was funny because I didn't decide that it couldn't be true. I decided that it was just like all the other adults. Whatever, you know. Um, Probably there was a lot of advice in my life I should have taken more quickly. I always had to learn the hard way on my own. Um, but be that as it may, I think people's failed lives is usually it's not as failed as they think. Like, let's say you've kept a garden for 20 years and you wanted to be president, but you never got to be president, but you kept your garden and you know, a lot of people would say that's meaningless. I don't think so. I think that, the enjoyment and the time and when you had someone by, they got to experience it and you took photos and people got to see the photos and it's like it sounds like a really low standard, maybe it is, but it's the more realistic standard of really you've accomplished some things. And I think a lot of times people when they think their life is a failure, they're just not acknowledging that, look, you could have done more or different things than you did. You made the decisions you did, like with Beardy Man. It's all meaningless, his strawberry garden. But he could have spent his time a lot of ways. Maybe some of them would have made him think like he was more of a success. But the way he did spend it is the real choice he made. It's the real like desire he had. And having achieved that, It's your real desire. It doesn't amount to much. You didn't save the world, but it does amount to something. It's definitely more than nothing. So, and if you struggled and you're sure that these 30 years of your life or whatever were, oh man, I just beat my head against the wall. I never got anywhere. Right, but then after that, you figured that out, right? So there's all almost there kind of is always a sort of progress. There might be some exceptions where people never get to this threshold of not being bad, but my view is kind of the Bob Marley view of if you're not doing wrong, then you're doing good. Um, if you're not perpetrating wrong, then you're doing all right, man. Your life is probably more of a success than you realize.